All right. So welcome to this session, which is on person name validation. So for those of you who aren't aware of all the different working groups we have at Unicode, one of them under CLDR, Common Locale Data Repositories, is dealing with personal names. And so far, we've been talking about how to format names, information about what name structure should look like, taking into consideration things such as how do you present that name, if it's a formal name or informal name, how do you handle nicknames, how do you handle abbreviations and things like that. But there's a problem with that. Not so much with what we've created or the data that's being created so far, but potentially with the developer. And that's that there's no data for how to validate a name. So we have a structure that's in place to define a name with multiple given names, multiple surnames, prefixes, titles, and so on. But right now you could put total garbage in it and it'll format it just fine according to the data that you have. So for the developer, that isn't terribly useful if they want to have some confidence in the information that they're getting in. So what ultimately the application developer or the data, whoever's actually creating the data wants to see is what you have on the left side, Jane Doe or Hayao Miyazaki, as opposed to multiple fonts, characters all over the place. The funny thing that you see around the letter E, that's called Zalgo text. That's where you put on as many combining accent marks as possible and see how the format comes out. Some people do that just for fun. You don't usually want to see emojis in the middle of the name, etc. So what do you do? Here we are. Well, we'll provide some form of simple validation. So with CLDR, it's Common Locale Data Repository, there's a number of contributors to CLDR, and they're experts on their languages. They're not experts in security. They're not experts in particular compliance laws and so on. So what we're looking at, what is reasonable for us to do is simple validation. We also realize that there are scenarios where you want to be more precise in validating, that it's more conformant to what you'd expect in the language that you're in. There are other times you might want to be less precise because you've got login names or you have annotations around a name that you don't normally have displayed like on a birth certificate or a passport, for instance. And also that different developers, different implementers may wish to have special customization because they have very specific rules that they need to put in place, and they like to sit on top of what's being built. So the goal is to come up with something that will give a degree of confidence that it's close to normal of what you would have. So where do we go once we decided we needed to have some form of validation? Well, data analysis. Over the years, like I've collected millions and millions of names from publicly available sources. Almost every country in the world that keeps data on its citizens also has statistical data about how many babies have been born with this given name. How many last names do we have in this region? It's actually really fascinating. Like you go into Spain and they have the breakdown by each one of the different districts, and you go into, you see Garcia, one of the most popular names and so on, until you get into, I think it's pronounced Quetta, is it? In North Africa, which is a state, a part of Spain. The most popular name is Mohammed. And so you can see differences that you have, and also helps to guide you in how a product should be in a particular region. We also look at existing software practices. What do different members of Unicode do with their own systems to kind of do a little bit of quality check or compliance check when someone is onboarding to the system? What are things that they allow? What do they not allow? And then doing research on name characteristics. What do you see when it's actually doing like an online driver's license form, or it's you're going to the UK has something called the deed poll if you want to change your name. What are regulations that they have? What are modern naming practices? Because as things have changed, people have taken on more of a tendency to have a unique name or a name that reflects their particular ethnicity or family background that may not be what you would normally consider what is a normal name within a region. And are there any regulatory constraints that we need to allow, usually through customization, and then get feedback? And we haven't gotten quite to the area of feedback for contributors to see what we need. So we came up with a series of levels for the validation. Strict is, and I'll go into more detail, strict is where it has the most rules applied to what is in a name. Customized, sort of like how we have collation and we have tailorable collation. You could potentially have tailorable validation if you have specific requirements for the region or regulatory environment that you're in. A more lenient case, which still gives you confidence that at least there's letters in the name, but allows you a lot more flexibility in what's available. And then minimal, which just makes sure that you aren't obfuscating or breaking the name to pieces. So strict validation would be more or less expectations that you'd have in a particular locale. But if someone is born in one country and they move to another country, they usually want to keep their name. So therefore, you have to expand it out beyond just a single language or single locale. So that leads to what I call affinity groups. Examples would be if someone is born in a particular region where Latin is the script that's used for their language, they move somewhere else, they're going to want to use their name in the same Latin characters to where they move to. But where they go to, the other languages are spoken, so therefore it might not quite fit in if it followed exactly what the rules are for that region. But for software and what keeping in your database, they should be allowed to move from region to region. We realized that some areas, some languages may use characters that are not normally used in most Latin-based languages. So we decided to narrow it down for one affinity group, which is basically all the major languages or modern languages that are supplied by the technical committee to Unicode, which is still on the order of about, I think it's 60 or so, 60, 80 languages just for Latin. And then for digitally disadvantaged languages, you would take what you need for the TC major languages and then add any additions that they have for DDL onto them. So example might be you have technical committees, Latin, and I'll give you some examples what that might look like. If you're in Han, then use Han as the set for all languages that sit on top of Han. So you'd have the various Chinese dialects and so on. Japanese would take that and then add on to it for Japanese scripts, etc. And the same for Cyrillic or Greek or Arabic or Hebrew, that you would use the union of what the expectations are for languages that sit on top of those scripts. So it becomes more script-based as opposed to language-based, but then having potential language, the ability for us to have specifics on a per language basis if needed. For the digitally disadvantaged languages, I mentioned like be the union of what you have, so TC and any additions for digitally disadvantaged language attributes that might be in addition to what you have for the core. So a tailored validation would be customizable by the client that uses the validator. If they have a specific set of characters, a specific set of punctuation, or possible length requirements. So some examples are what goes on a passport. That's all defined by the International Airline Association's technical standard for travel documents, which specifies down to a very specific set of characters that are allowed on the visible portions of a passport for the machine readable parts. UK DPOL they point to a document and say, you can use any characters that are in this list, which is quite long, and they give you some warnings ahead of time that the first set of characters they present, we can be able to get those as input into your form, but they're going to look bad. And you'll use the decimal values for anything that doesn't look right, but is in the list. But when we send you your new name, it'll actually be formatted correctly. US has some interesting naming laws. For instance, in California, no diacritics are allowed in a legal name when you register with the DMV or a birth certificate and so on. So if your name is Jose, with an accent at the end of your name, that's too bad. You're just Jose or Jose, whatever. But you can add it in afterwards, but not on your driver's license. Japan has some very specific naming requirements. They have something called Jimyo Kanji, which is the name you're supposed, list of kanji characters that you're supposed to use for naming a child, or katakana, and a very limited set of punctuation that's allowed. If you're doing onboarding into financial systems, compliance systems that you talk to may also have very specific requirements in limiting what characters are allowed, or the mapping back. So the tailored would allow you to then map to those different situations. A lenient validation would be when you need more flexibility. So let's say you have annotated names. So you have Hayao Miyazaki and you want to have his kanji in the same fields in the name. Lenient would allow that, along with the punctuation around it. It would allow all letters for all scripts. So even though you might be in a Latin-based language, we go ahead and allow any other characters from outside. So it's on the lenient side. It allow most all punctuation, but a note for that is that you could potentially create unsafe sequences that you don't want to have for cross-site scripting or SQL injection, things like that. We're not looking at that, and we'll talk about that a bit. We would say no emoji. That would be like the limit of saying, no, you can't have, happy face, flaming dragon as your name in emoji. And you also want to avoid confusables, so you don't mix things together. So you can't have a name part or part of a name. So like you have this Hayao Miyazaki up here, you have Latin, you have punctuation, you have kanji. But you can't have, for instance, a Greek delta, Latin O, Latin E for Doe and Jane Doe. They have to all be the same script when you have a sequence of ranges. The main reason for that is to avoid confusables, where you're mixing in Greek, Russian, Cherokee, and Latin all at the same time to make it look like something else. And a name field cannot be all punctuation. Minimal validation basically says you've got real Unicode, and I don't have any control characters and minimal formatting characters, and I have to have at least one letter in each populated field. So that's basically it. Try to avoid invisible and zero width situations, except there are contexts where that should be allowed when you have Arabic, or you have cases where you need variations on Asian characters. So you can have emoji if you want. You can throw in mathematical symbols. It's lenient. The main thing is that it helps to avoid obfuscation, where you're doing, let's say, all Latin and a direction indicator. So the text says one thing, but in reality, when it's scanned, it's the reverse and says something different. That's a technique that's used oftentimes in China when they want to say something about the government. They'll use Unicode bi-directional indicators to be able to put in the reverse of the comment they want to make about the government, but it will display as something else so that they don't get caught by actually, displays is what they want to see, but it gets scanned as something that the regulators go, oh, it's no problem. So assumptions for data that would go into the validators are A, if there's any HTML or XML entities, those ampersand, hash, number, semicolon, those sorts of things, that's all resolved. Anything that says like ampersand, ellipses, semicolon, those are all resolved. Let's assume that that's all been taken care of before entering into the validator. If it's still in the data that goes in, we assume that's the name that you want. But if you want to put your name as ampersand, ellipsis, semicolon, then that's what we'll assume it is. The data is expected to already be normalized to normalization form C, or the pre-composed form, in the smallest form. We don't do any data security. That we have a technical report UTR number 36 on Unicode security considerations, which goes into much more detail. It's expected that is done by the client on its own. And there's also a guidelines from the Open Worldwide Application Security Project, or OWASP, which if whoever the security team is, the security team takes care of all the data going in, and they should be doing the scanning for cross-site scripting, SQL injection, and so on. The reason why we didn't do that is because the security patterns that you look for are very different depending on the context of where the data is going. Sometimes it's going to a database, sometimes it's all in HTML, sometimes otherwise. So that we decided that should be taken care of by the implementers because they know the context of their system. We know the context of what name should look like. The two normalization forms that we use internally is normalization form, or NFC, for precompose, the most tightest form of your Unicode characters, and then NFD, decompose, where it breaks down to base character plus any combining marks. So when data, if it's a whole name object with multiple name fields, at least one field needs to be populated. That's just a given. It has to be either at least one the given field or a surname field. We don't choose one or the other because you can have someone that has a mononym like Zendaya, and I don't know if Zendaya is a given name or a surname, so whichever one's filled in, that's the one that would be assumed. If it's a standalone string that you're just passing a string in to be validated, it can't be empty. That's an obvious one. So if the client, whoever calls a validator, has specific requirements, they'll need to decide what those requirements are. So first major requirement has to be valid Unicode, and they should not be invisible characters. It's so all data has to be valid defined Unicode. We avoid control characters, so that's your bell, backspace, things of that sort. No invisible characters. However, there's some exceptions where you sometimes need those characters to format things. One example is with Unihan, a character may display differently, whether it's Chinese or Japanese, and to provide the ability for to display the right one, depending on the context, there are variation indicators which are invisible, but would be allowed with ideographic characters. A variation character on letters A through Z, so you can go ahead and break up the ability for scanners to find things. That shouldn't be allowed. Once data comes in as a name field, let's say a given name, it's then tokenized, and we follow Unicode UAX 29, the Unicode text segmentation. And that looks at based on the script and breaks the fields into various tokens of the same types together. So it would be letter tokens or non-letter tokens, basically what we'd be looking at. So you take Miyazaki and his name in kanji, and you can see it's broken into two letter groups, Miyazaki in Latin and in kanji, and then three non-letter tokens, a space and two parentheses. If I take a made-up name, Van O'Leary, the segmentation engine understands that an apostrophe between two letters is part of the whole word. So it breaks this up into two letter tokens and then one non-letter, which is the space. The apostrophe itself is recognized as part of the letter tokens. So once it's broken into tokens, then start doing the analysis. So a name has to have letters. So that needs to be at least one of the tokens has got letters in it from beginning to end, just straight letters. So these are examples. This is Jane Doe in Latin, Arabic, and Japanese. Those are okay. But if you have fields that come in that are just punctuation or emoji and mathematical characters and so on, that would be not okay. Pretty straightforward. Non-spacing letters. So these are letters that have to be appropriate for the surrounding script. And so these are usually deal with formatting elements that help, for instance, Arabic. When you get to the end of an Arabic sequence, there's punctuation that would end up inheriting from the Arabic that you want to switch to left to right instead of right to left. It makes sense to be able to put in a formatting character in there, as opposed to putting in right to left sequences in the middle of Latin, between Latin and Latin. That does not make sense. Then you have non-letters. And when non-letters repeat, there's some cases where that makes sense. One example is nested brackets. If you need to have something that has got nested brackets, we don't know why you want to have multiple parentheses, but it's legal formatting. However, you should not see repeating characters, and we'll take a look at that. So some variables that would be set, like what's the maximum number of identical non-letters. So if you have comma, 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 and the max identical non-letters is 2 or 1, then that would be considered being a fault, which we report back. Max repeating non-letters, so if you have comma, period, comma, semicolon, just a long sequence, how many of those does make sense that you want to put a marker in? Because a lot of hacking robots oftentimes will go and just start spitting in random characters for input fields. And then allowed repeating non-letters. So it'd be like an array of strings that say, yeah, we find it's okay to see this sequence in order or this sequence in order to be in place. These would not be checked for the minimal validation. You want to allow balanced punctuation. So if you have an opening punctuation there, and there's a matching closing punctuation, you should see both of those in the field. And then the times where you want to have punctuation that's allowed in the middle of a field, as opposed to oftentimes punctuation at the beginning of a string is not correct for most languages. Don't start a string with a comma. You don't have the unbalanced parentheses with your backward parentheses and so on. So simple checks in that regard. Combining marks are a fun one. So for combining marks, what we would do is it gets normalized to normalization form D or decomposed, which then takes the characters, breaks them into their base character, plus whatever combining marks would be needed to create the character that was passed in. So a couple of examples we have here are an S, D, and a Q, both of them with 2 accent marks, one above and one below, and they break down into a string of a base character plus 2 combining marks. So things we look at is a combining mark should not be by itself. It should not be before, or it should not be after a non-letter. You shouldn't see 2 of the same combining mark next to each other, and you don't want to have more than a certain number of combining marks. So what we've seen in almost all alphabetic languages, no more than 2 accents or 2 combining marks. So Vietnamese, for instance, you think there's tons of them. It's just because you see lots of characters with 2 accents on them, but there are none with 3. So for most cases, it would be just 3. However, there are some languages, and the reason why you would have a validator that would then assume by language. So you have language, what's called an abugida script. There's like Myanmar, Tibetan, Devanagari, and some others. Tex had a talk a little earlier showing a Devanagari character and how it takes multiple non-spacing combining marks combined on top of the base character to create your final one. And one example is this one that I can't pronounce. It's a Tibetan Hakshmalawarayam something, but that is a single base character followed by, I think it's 8 combining characters. So the rules that you have for one language, a set of scripts, you cannot apply across all of them because you have different characteristics for those languages and different characteristics for what's required to be able to create the graphemes in those languages. Then repeating letters, you want to not allow long sequences of the same letter. So the way that would work is, again, you do the normalization form D so you can get all the accents, throw out the accents, put it back together, and you say, what are the sequence of letters that I have? And in doing analysis across millions of names, have not seen any, at least Latin strings with 4 or more characters in a row. It's not unusual, it's rare, but not unusual to see 3 letters in a row. Oftentimes for the German concatenated word strings can get pretty long. But the idea would be that you're looking for this as one of your checks. And then this, again, would be something that can be set on in the data by the script and language. And then when you have multiple scripts to make it so you only have one, all the letters within each token, after you've tokenized it into letter tokens and non-letter tokens, each token has to be in only one script at a time. So the example with Hayao Miyazaki, that's okay. And this one below, I took Gal Gadot and put her name in both Latin and in Hebrew at the same time. But the way that gets tokenized, that's considered to be a single token with multiple scripts in it. So that would not be allowed. If the names were separated out so that they make separate tokens, that would be allowed in the lenient validation. And to get more strict, in Unicode, in CLDR, every single language has a set of what are called exemplar characters. So these are characters that are used commonly to represent words in that language. It's a little bit different between each language. So example of English and French, and highlighted in blue the differences between the two. But if someone has moved from France to the US or vice versa, and their name or from the UK or whatever to France, they should be able to take their name along with them. In the same way, there's punctuation sets based on per language. To be able to make it work, you need to create these affinity sets to allow the name portability from one region to another. Even though the language of that region might change, they should be able to keep the name that they had initially. So this would be an example of taking all modern Latin-based languages, and that's a long list that says this is from one of the Unicode utilities for properties that have an exemplar in the set, and each one of these is a language name that is a modern language supported by the technical committee, and it comes back with the set down below. And the hyphens are for ranges of characters, so like A through Z, and then beta through umlaut, and then on down the line. And so you can see the list for all Latin-based locales or languages is a lot shorter than what you have for like all the Cyrillic-based, which would include Russian, Ukrainian, etc. Is much shorter, which is the A through, and I don't know the name of the Russian letter, and then a few others at the end. And then that would be the set. So when you do the validation for a name that has a base that you're using as the language validation that sits on top of a particular script, in this case, let's say you do Latin, then the name has to at least be composed of characters that are in this list. So the advantage is you can't use mathematical symbols, you can't use Greek if it's Latin-based, you can't use enclosed circles. Those text messages you get that are all in bold or italic, those won't work because those are actually different characters that are outside of the exemplar character ranges. So you can't have somebody trying to make a fun name registering for a driver's license that's all in bold and italic or enclosed values. If you have a tailored set, so let's say you're working for the DMV, have an exciting job working in COBOL and creating a database that is based for onboarding people's names in DMV, and you get to choose the letters A through Z, and that's it. No punctuation. I think you can use a space. No, they allow a hyphen. However, if you're changing your name to I'm happy today or something in the UK, which is an allowed name if you like, can't call yourself sir or madame unless that's a title given to you. They're very specific about that, but you can say my name is I'm happy today. They have their list, and you would choose the list that's given of the allowed characters from the UK deed poll, and then that would be tailored. So it's not something that initially CLDR would support, I mean would maintain, but would support doing the tailoring or customization for particular regions. So what we are not doing, we're not doing things like checking to see does the name have no vowels? One of the issues there is that depending on the language, there are languages where what in your language might be considered a consonant, but in their language is a vowel. For instance, that's Tum, Tyler, and Ing on the top. There's no Western vowels in those. Tum is a Welsh name. Tyler is something someone made up. It has the letter Y, which would be considered a vowel. Ing has no vowels, but is a common name. We're not doing like single letter checks. Well, we are doing a check to at least be sure there's at least one letter that would be in a field. But you have like names like Malcolm X, Harry S. Truman. His middle name was the letter S, and he just picked it because it was a fancy, because people had middle initials and looked fancy when they did that. But that's his name. Karen O is a Korean, I think, actor, and her name is O. In the UK, they'd probably make her put an H after the name, but the name is just Karen O. We're not doing any checks for scatological or offensive or derogatory terms. The reason why is it's a huge and changing list, and it changes by language. And also an issue that I found doing research on the names of the study called onomastics, which is the study of names based on the places that they're in. And there's a number of, thank you, 4-letter names that, or 4-letter swear words that you might have in one language that are actually names in some other regions. And also you have various derogatory terms that are parts of other names. So it gets really complex. So that also we're not doing any statistical or gibberish name checks. The systems that do that have got extensive amount of work on the studies and the research that's involved, and you either need to carry around a huge bucket of data with you or have a service to connect to that has to be maintained on a regular basis. And we're not intending to do that. That is something that can be done by your own systems. So next steps, we need to complete the proposal that we're in the process of writing, get the data structures that define what the rules are nailed down so that it can be implemented and prototyped in code, and start getting review feedback. Does it fit what we need for the requirements of the regions that we're in? And that is a quick overview of name validation. Any questions? Ms. Nova.
When it comes to the letter rule, what is that Jennifer 8?
So the question was, when it comes to the letter rule, we have Jennifer 8 Lee. So Jennifer would be a given name, that's allowed. Lee would be a surname, that would be allowed. And then we either have a middle name exception or you have a tailorable part. But if it's like strict validation and it's a tailored system for compliance, it wouldn't be allowed. It would have to be spelled out. But if it were a lenient, it could be allowed, put into place. So looking at the name validators, so things like that we still have discussions on for names outside of the base name when you get into the suffixes and prefixes, for instance. Most systems require them to not be letters. So if it was Jennifer Lee the 8th, it would have to be Roman numerals. But that happened like for Elon Musk's son, I want to say Kyle, but it's a XAE ligature 12. And so they had to actually spell out 12 as Roman numerals to register in California. So yeah, Jennifer 8 would be a context-based situation. Any other questions?
Okay, I guess there's no other questions. So thank you very much, Mike.
Sure.